Thank you, Judy, and thank you everyone for being here. This has been such a beautiful, synchronistic conference, and it's kind of sad that it's coming to a close, and kudos that you made it here on Sunday morning. And I'm so excited. I want to thank CIIS and the East-West Psychology Program, and of course the C.G. Jung Institute. And I'm going to get a little wacky in my presentation. I always laugh a little bit when I get into Jungian communities because the material is like magical, wild, chaotic, bizarre, and Jungians are so like contained and buttoned up, and I am neither. So, although I did button a shirt today, so that was, yeah, I'm here. Okay, so as Judy said, the topic, it's called Atonement to the Earth Mother, Cybele, an ecopsychological, ecofeminist, archetypal remembering. And that's a mouthful. And in the next slide, there's the formal description, which is even more of a mouthful. From across an eco-psychological, ecofeminist, as well as a Jungian archetypal perspective, the myth of Cybele and Attis is quite complex. Jung's focus on this myth was with Cybele as both mother and beloved, Attis's mother complex and self-castration, and both of their madness. Yet Cybele has much deeper roots as an Anatolian Phrygian goddess, and there was no Attis in her earliest story. So this presentation will unpack and restory Cybele as the tale of the disembodiment of human from nature, the original trauma, the separation of the divine feminine and masculine, as well as offer remembrance of our deeper story. So that's a lot there to cover in a short amount of time. And it's a topic that the way I stumbled into it has a much larger story. But some years back, I found myself immersed in the learning and being in personal situations where drag was coming into my life in a way that well, this is so interesting. And at the time I was, and still teaching a lot in Jungian platforms and doing so much research. And so I just looked up one day, I wonder if any scholars have written about, any Jungian scholars have written about drag. And there weren't that many, which was kind of surprising. And I found a young man's kind of thesis. It wasn't even his final work, but just a little blurb about it. And he mentioned this cult of the Gali and Cybele, and it just tumbled me into this whole story that I had never heard about. And so I've been studying this story for about 2 years, and I feel like I'm just maybe in the middle of the story. So this is very emergent. And in the next slide, I've got just the caution symbol, because I just want to say that it is a really sensitive, complex, wacky, and very also serious topic. And it divides into positionalities that are complex and complicated. And it presents so many different lenses depending where you're coming from, whether you're a Jungian or an ecofeminist, an eco-psychologist, a trans woman, a trans activist, a third gender spiritual being, an indigenous person, a Christian scholar, a pagan scholar, psychologist, social anthropologist, historian, or a drag artist. So there's so much there, and there's so many opportunities to offend someone with this presentation. So I just want you to know that I honor and respect our varied positionalities and recognize that there's so many variances, even with all of these categories and considerations when working with this material. And so basically, I hope nothing in my presentation offends you, but I hope it keeps your eyes open. Okay, so in this next slide, as Judy said, I'm a professor at CIIS in the Transformative Studies Ph.D. program. And so my main areas are ecopsychology and transformative learning. So I geek out on anything that has to do with transformation. And so I love this quote by Jung in terms of transformation and the archetype of transformation, saying, but the process itself involves another class of archetypes, which one could call the archetypes of transformation. They are genuine symbols precisely because they are ambiguous, full of half-grounded principles. This discriminating intellect naturally keeps on trying to establish their singleness of meaning and thus misses the essential point. For what we can above all establish as the one thing consistent with their nature is their manifold meaning, their limitless wealth of reference, which makes an unilateral formulation impossible. And so such with my presentation, it's one of those research inquiries that you can just keep spinning and pulling apart in such fascinating and beautiful ways. Okay, I'll let you take that picture and then we'll go to the next slide. Oh, wait, let's go back, yeah. Okay.
I missed the beginning thing.
Gotcha, okay. And so then just to situate, I know there's many folks here that are well-versed in ecopsychology, but if it's not your area of concentration, ecopsychology is really viewing the state of the earth and the state of our human psyches as interconnected and mutually dependent. And there's 4 major assumptions. The first is that the planet is calling for healing. And we know all this with the ecological crisis and all of the issues that are going on. And then the second is that people are calling for healing. And we obviously see so much suffering in the world. And then in more psychological communities, we see the complexity and widespreadness of all of that. And then the third, that these are not separate phenomenon. These illnesses are all part of the same pathology. And so the fourth is really saying that the sickness, the illness is embedded in the history and culture of Western civilization. And I, in the present, always extend that to a global corporate ties reality. And so, that's a lot to digest. And it's so interesting with even what Becca Tarnas was doing in her last presentation and rooting that point of moving towards a Western framework with Descartes and then upward, just really looking at that. What was the point of what Chellis Glendinning calls the original trauma when humans, particularly humans of Western civilization, broke with our nature-based traditions and separated our identities, our souls, and our psyches from Earth, which is obviously impossible to do in the long term, and hence where Jung and others talk about this collective unconscious. And then another situating, just shortly, is ecofeminism, which I relate with quite a lot and have been mentored so highly in that area, and just really looking at how the oppression of Earth and the oppression of women go hand in hand. Okay, so there's some baselines. And then I thought it would be interesting in the next slide to go through some perspectives from some of the founders of ecopsychology on Jung, because I actually came into more of the Jungian paradigm through ecopsychology. And it was funny, a few years ago I had that book on the Returning the Self to Nature come out, and I looked at the back cover and it was classified under Jungian, and I was, what? I'm not a Jungian, I'm Jungish, I'm not a, and as I came into these worlds and kind of mapping some of these concepts together, the lineage of ecopsychology and seeing how strongly it's mapped onto Jungian traditions and vice versa. And I've always been very into transpersonal psychology, and more recently really gel with depth psychology. All right, so a couple of things here, and the quote unquote father of ecopsychology is Theodore Roszak, and he always brought up the collective unconscious as one of the most kind of important concepts for ecopsychology, and really saying that it was a repository for the compounded evolution of our species. And funny enough, sometimes I block things out in my own psyche. I'm sure other people here do that too. But when I first started studying ecopsychology, I really translated the collective unconscious as the collective conscious, because all of the natural world and the cosmos is quite aware of itself. It's really a human fallacy in so many ways that creates the collective unconscious. So I just kind of filtered that out, and so really looking at this, and Roszak also said the deepest and most influential substratum of the collective unconscious is our archaic pre-human experience. And so this is the material that coalesces into the Jungian archetype as shadow, and an constellation of unruly animal vitality, which Freud could easily associate with the id. And we'll unpack this a little bit more. And so looking at how Jung pulled the collective unconsciousness severely into although he recognized so much this animal sensory vitality, and himself was so immersed in nature, and towards the end of his life especially was so critical of Western civilization and the importance to re-identify in this way. Much of his scholarship really brought the collective consciousness into a very human lens. And so that's something to look. And so in a lot of the Jungian material, we, in a lot of ways, lose our older prehistory and instead situate into Western imagery, particularly Greeks and Roman mythology, which I actually, and so important to this presentation, find fascinating, because this is really the kind of a collection of what was happening in the time where we separated from our earth-based traditions, and Western civilization was really establishing in such a wide level. I had a big aha this summer. I was at a Shakespeare festival where I live in Boulder. And I think it was, I don't know if it was Henry II or the Third, whichever it was. And I just, I've gone to so many Shakespeare things, but I was like, oh, this whole thing is talking about the old gods. And it just hit home in such a different way. And for Jungians, so much of the material of the Greek mythologies and Roman, it's like a map of the old gods. And for ecopsychologists, it's really so rich in being able to look at the material that connect our earth-based ways without necessarily appropriating Indigenous, Native American, First Nations traditions. So really interesting in this way. And so we're probably all familiar with Jung, often talked about this concept of the 2 million-year-old man, and really looking at how our psyche's foundation forms from that history. And then we have these layers, the house that he would use as imagery that builds up upon. And so one of my favorite Jungian ecopsychologists is Dennis Merritt, who builds on this a lot. And he's, highlights how Jung really saw our animal soul, our primal soul in the positive way as this 2 million-year-old man. And so it's really our instinctual, our somatic, our sensual, our intuitive, our feminine. And so those parts of ourselves that are so buried and cut off in a lot of phenomenon. And then there's also this, we've talked about it, but in terms of the split in our Western consciousness. And so, we were talking about Descartes and then going up, and I loved how Becca in her last thing was saying that it was really Freud wasn't the instigator of that, but a lot of the culmination of being able to see our split in psyche. And so another foundational eco-psychology scholar, Paul Shepard, said we've been ideologically deflowered, and the demythologically, I can't even speak this much, but our demythologizing set in motion by the ancient Greeks and Hebrews seems overwhelming. And he also saw how archetypal imagery represents the real past world. And so eco-psychologists really cherish this work of Jung because it's bringing us back to this, as I said before. And it's just fascinating how these Greek and Roman archetypes that are so readily drawn from this knowledge are also just marking that time of transition, really this time from that marks the hunter-gatherer moving into civilization to kind of agricultural societies, so that shift. And so another thing that Jung really offers, we'll get into this a little bit more. And so eco-psychology, if all of nature is spirit and self, and we've disconnected from nature, we've really split ourselves and spirit. So just looking at this split in this way, not only in terms of our human collective, but really ourselves as being fully nature beings, fully embodied beings, fully spiritual beings, and what happens with that. And so that godliness, sacredness, split selves, we separate, and then we have all of these demons, psychoses, complexes, because we're no longer integrated with this instinctual earth-based psyche. Our creativity, our femininity, our ecological animal selves. And I love just how many of the presentations this weekend really doubled down on this archetypal gateway to our unconscious, and it's also our gateway to actively participating in reanimating our natural earth-based and more than that beings. Ooh, yeah, I feel that. Okay, and so in our next slide, we get to see Cybele, which I'm like, body positivity, yes. On the left there, you see Cybele comes from, she's a great mother goddess, a great goddess, earth mother. And this is a figure from, known as Catalhuyuk, and you'll hear me mispronounce terms all the time because I'm one of those people that reads a lot without discussing with others, and so I may not know the correct pronunciation. But this was discovered in southern Anatolia, which is now Turkey, of course. And this is from about 7,000 to maybe 5,000 BC. And as you see, she's, powerful, strong, and then flanked by these two lions. And Cybele is just an amazing, amazing figure and representation. And so Catalhuyuk is also Anatolian and also Phrygian. And both the Greeks and Romans, as her name at some point was Cybele, and then it shifted when the Greeks appropriated, came to Greek civilization, she became Cybele, and then a lot of the Romans what Roman scholars will call her Cybele or Cybele, so lots of different names. And so, so many, Jung, Joseph Campbell, another person that I'll mispronounce, Eric Newman, yeah.
It's Neumann.
Neumann, that's right. Yes. I was actually in a Uber with another presenter last night. We were talking, and he said that. I was like, "Oh, I'm so glad you said that." And then this morning, he said, "Oh, I forgot how it's pronounced." And something that and so once the Greeks and then the later Roman civilizations were established and they brought Cybele there, it was about a 6,000 year period where she was a very, very strong presence, which I found fascinating since I had never heard about her until a few years ago. And I call myself very Buddhist, and I found it really interesting that a lot of Buddhist and Tantric mother goddesses, the icons that you see of a goddess seated with lions or different animals actually came from these traditions, from the great mother traditions. And sometimes you'll see them with 4 or 6 arms. So just bringing it in. And so many of us are used to seeing lions straddling building stoops or other goddesses. And so it's a motif. And the image on the right brings it all the way to more of the Roman version of Cybele. And there's so much there where she was more formal and established. And in this image, she's got I probably mispronounced this, but Typhonon, the drum that was used for rites, and very similar to a lot of the illusion rites. Okay, and so another piece with Cybele with this lion symbolism, and often she was pictured with raptors, and she was known as the mother of mountains. Like she's this really wild, powerful, strong woman. And you can go, yeah, you can stay there. And she's known as lion symbolism, royalty, dignity, strength, power, earth, motherhood, sensuality. And Neumann would, and others would call this the Lady of the Beast. So she's a very pre-agricultural goddess. And so Neumann also points out the differences between male and female gods and goddesses and when they appear with animals. So the males, it's usually like some like struggle, like battle, aggressive fight with the animals. And the women, they're like, the animals either, in her lap, hanging out by side. She's got power with rather than fighting and battling. And what I found so interesting is that before the ladies of the beast, even before that, the lady would actually be the lion or be the animal even without the human form. And so this type of image connotated that the self is not yet centered in ego, and more so that it was a body self. And so I find this so fascinating, and like the centering and then pulling out, and then we'll get into the story of Cybele and Attis shortly. But in this slide, we've got so Cybele, Earth Mother, Mountain Goddess. She's a great mother, but she's not like a mother. She's not. Not that mothers are like tranquil and just domestic, and but she wasn't like birthing. Maybe she was, but traditionally pictured with a bunch of kids and being all graceful and kind and subdued. I wouldn't mess with Cybele at all, right? Okay, and she her story travels through time, as I've said, the time of Western splitting, of moving from pre-agricultural history into agricultural civilization, particularly when she's taken from Phrygian culture into Greek civilization. And so what's interesting is that as the Greeks appropriated her, and we'll see in this next slide, suddenly Cybele had a backstory where she was Agdistis, and even though this was another kind of creation, I love Agdistis because Agdistis is both gendered, female and male, so androgynous and born from Zeus and a mountain rock. So like, well, that's kind of a pretty cool combination, right? And the gods feared Agdistis. It's like, you can't be all genders and so wild. And so they were frightened of the power of Agdistis. And so they actually castrated Agdistis. And then Agdistis became Cybele. So warning, we're going to be talking quite a bit about castration, a popular topic among many, but just a little warning, not a dinner conversation for a lot of people, but really important in this story. And so this splitting of the male and female goddesses, and so as we get into the story, and so we're talking about splitting and the split in Western consciousness, the straddle of going from pre-agricultural to, so you're following. In some ways, the story kind of becomes like a hidden narrative of what was happening in the times in our psyches and in the collective. So really, really interesting. And so Agdistis is castrated, becomes Cybele. I think we've got one more, just one more powerful Cybele slide. I always think it's interesting as Cybele goes from Anatolian to Greek to Roman, her waistline gets really small too. I'm like, hey, I like the full-bodied, powerful Cybele. They're all powerful. And so as we go into the next slide with the story of Cybele and Attis, it gets even more complex. So put your seatbelt on. And there's so many versions of this story. You've got one is where a man brought the rights of Cybele to Attica in Greece, and this man was killed, and so they honored him by establishing the cult of Cybele. So that's one interpretation. Another is that Attis himself, and Attis is actually, the word comes from in Anatolia, in Phrygian culture, just the priest would be called Attis, but wasn't necessarily deeply associated with Cybele. But then Attis takes on a whole new story in life. Another story is that Attis was born from Agdistis's castrated part and then becomes a tree and a nymph who is impregnated from the tree. So basically that Cybele is also Attis's mother's one form. Another is, which is kind of similar to a biblical story we might remember, is Attis is an orphan left on the bank of a river, and then later falls in love with Cybele, who forbids him to love anyone else. But he falls in love with a river nymph, and Cybele causes, at their wedding, his other wedding, causes him to go mad and castrate himself at the actual wedding, right? Yeah, and then, and this is similar to the most famous version where Attis is a beautiful shepherd boy who Cybele falls in love with, because she is the other half of himself or herself. He is the other half of herself and vice versa. And after pledging his devotion to Cybele, he breaks this vow and is betrothed to the king's daughter. And Cybele, she crashes the wedding, and Attis castrates himself and dies. And then Cybele is just so sorrowful, she convinces Zeus to resurrect him, and he ascends into the celestial world. So, I mean, this is like soap opera, like 101, 1001. But the version that I'm most struck by is where Attis comes to Cybele for protection, to escape the advances of a king. And here it's Attis castrates himself to avoid the unwanted advances of this king, and finds basically asylum with Cybele. And he's found by priests of the Great Mother, who find his body after he self-castrates and bury him in their temple. And then they these priests start instituting the annual rites to commemorate Attis. So Cybele and her entourage as really providing safe harbor for someone who was not in a safe place in Greek civilization. To lighten it for a few moments, there's also, Attis has these symbols of the pine tree, of which he was born in some versions, but it's also the symbol of eternal life, the only thing that's alive in the dead of winter. And then the Phrygian hat, which I don't know if folks are familiar with the Phrygian hat, but it has a very interesting story, how it went all the way from Phrygia to France, and a few centuries ago, and enslaved folks that were freed would wear these hats back in the day to symbolize that they were emancipated. And just a little story on this summer, while I think I maybe had already submitted the proposal for this, or maybe not, or was in that, and I was like, this is so wacky. Do you really want to put this out here? And I happened to be invited by a colleague to go to the psychedelic science conference in Denver. And I'm not an active psychedelic participant these days, but I said, I'll pop in for a little bit. And and then I happened to be milling about when my friend was like, we need to go get a Phrygian hat. And I was like, what? And it really, I didn't bring it, but I have like a Smurf-like Phrygian hat now. And so I took that as a sign that I should continue with my research. And now I have a cool pink hat. And so then in the next slide, we've got the, we've got the Roman, more of the in Roman Cybele. From the Greek times, Cybele was eventually brought to Rome as what's known as the Magna Mater, and Great Mother, and there's a whole long story about it, how it happened. And through all of these times, there's the mixing of all of these different cultures and appeasements of bringing different symbols in to bring harmony to all of these different groups. And so Cybele actually became more of a tale of Rome in terms of the city and representing the city. And it was actually a wealthy noblewoman that was able to bring Cybele in form of stone to Rome. And there Cybele turns into not only kind of a protector of the city, and often you'll see symbols where she has like more of a city hat and different things. But then she actually became presented as like fertility and motherhood, virginity, purity, in a time where Rome really needed to increase its human population. And so this whole push on procreativity, Cybele says so. And the Roman period was from about 2018 BC to the 4th century AD. And then when we get into in Greece and later Rome. On the next slide, we'll see the cult of Cybele and introduce these characters called the Galli, which are just fascinating. And so the Galli were the attendants of Cybele, the cult of Cybele, and they really did a lot of her liminal, ecstatic rites and were the holders of this. And what's quite striking about the Galli wore dresses. They had long hair that they bleached blonde, and they used makeup, and they put it on. And many of them were castrated, but not all. So they were in some ways like a eunuch cult, but really devoted to the great mother, Cybele. So it's like, what? And similar to like mendicant monks, they often had to beg for food. There wasn't a lot of payroll coming out from the Cybele rites, and some also were sex workers to survive. And they're known for their ecstatic and bloody rites. There was a day of sorrow and mourning for Attis, and in this, some would castrate or self-harm, newly initiates, and all of this represented in some ways the death and resurrection of Attis. And then the next day would be all about ecstatic celebration, which for most of us are like, oh, I don't think in one day I can be all ecstatic after that. But there's so much there. And definitely the devotion to the great mother. But I found some just really provocative, powerful scholars writing about this, like newer scholars, where the Galli can really be seen as rejecting modes of masculinity and refusing to conform to the normative conditions of manhood in the Roman world, while at the same time equally rejecting modes of femininity and the conditions of womanhood. So in a lot of ways, the Galli and Cybele are like social activists, social dissidents saying like no to these two binary, like you need to be this or this, and this is what this means, and this is what, like no, like we're gonna reclaim our wildness, our transpersonal origins, all of these, our chaos, all our magical abilities. So really saying no and holding this story of the old ways and a lot of, and the rejection of being captured into these new identities. When I was doing the research for this, just even looking at gender in Greek times and like, the infinite number of categories there were. I was like, oh, we think we're straddling so many different positionalities now. Like, ooh, if you were in Greece, we'd have to know quite a lot more. So really interesting. And so in terms of the Galli, they were very third gender, transpersonal, and spiritual. And a lot of this, in terms of the iconographic markers, the acts that they were doing and the way they presented were intentional in creating like shock, ambiguity, deliberately masking aspects of identity in their pursuit of otherness. And so in people participating in these rites, you imagine just being like, whoa, it's like witnessing something that we just can't fit into our worldview. So of course, we're already going to be pushed into the liminal and then plunging into all of these different rites. Something's probably bound to happen. So our archetypes of transformation. And so, so spiritual priests, these Galli are. I think go to the next slide. We got a couple more pictures here of some Galli. And then I think there's one more slide. it's really beautiful. And so, yeah, transformation, transpersonal, embodied, ecstatic, non-ordinary states of awareness. And when we, and let's go to the next slide, and not to put a downer, because we all love Jung, and Jung had kind of some problematic mentions of how he saw the story of Cybele and Attis, but we're going to redeem and renew forever Jung him at the end. So hold your what? And so in some cases, Jung associated Cybele as like the beloved mother, and where the mother could represent redemption, devotion, fertility, awe, and protection. And then a lot of critics of Jung said that he really minimized this myth and the archetypes here, making them so much about matriarchy and universal goddess worship, and collapsing them into what he called the mother complex. And really, we know this as the devouring mother. And Neumann, when he would bring into the great goddess, as he would talk about her as the goddess of hunt of the war, yet for males is the goddess of death, and that she would dehumanize men and transform them into wild beasts, making them hunt, go to war, and provide protection. You know, think about the earliest Catalhoyuk, you know, those men who were not going to probably challenge her when she said, go hunt and get some food and protect the villages. Yet, Neumann says, when they break free of the goddess culture, then they turn against the feminine. And Jung problematically wrote that the effects of mother complex, the devouring mother, is a form of, he called it a form of psychopathology, and included things like Don Juanism as well as homosexuality. But to his credit, Jung did not view homosexuality as negative, but he did hold all sorts of stereotypes around it. And then in looking at the story of Cybele and Attis, Jung labeled it as the effects of a mother complex on the son, associated with self-castration, madness, and early death. And he viewed it as immature developments. And the mother culture, the view of this mother cultures in general as immature was held by many of Jung's contemporaries. And so these mother goddesses were often reduced as hunters' supplication to the goddess in order to feed one's family, and ritual castration to appease the mother goddess. And then there's all sorts of things that we could get to in terms of some of the curtness and looking at anima in relationship to this story. But that's a whole other thing. But of course, just looking at anima in a troubling way rather than like a powerful way, or going even deeper into ecopsychologists, of course, love the anima mundi, world soul, but also in the sensory, feminine, powerful way. Jung also troubling claimed that in the case of anima possession, that the patient will want to change himself into a woman through self-castration, where he's afraid that something of the sort will be done to him by force. And so while there's some negative things in the connotations with Jung, and we see him in other areas too, there's so much more depth to bringing some of his other views to this story, which we'll do shortly, particularly with terms like, Conjunctio and Sigi and Hieros Gamos, and we'll get back into that. But let's go to the next slide. Okay, so bringing it back to ecopsychology, and particularly in, I brought up Cellist Glendining's work with the original trauma and the point that humans, particularly humans of Western civilization, broke with our earth-based traditions. And so I feel like the myth of Cybele and Attis, when put into an and of course Attis, put into an ecopsychological, ecofeminist framing, it's fully centered on our splitting of our primal nature in the Western paradigm, where we moved from beings that are sacred of nature, of soul, to ones that are split and fixed into ego, thinking mind, the individual, disembodied, desouled. And so we've looked at the story of the Greek story of Attis, and so we've got dismemberment, disremembering, disembodiment, and this like actual splitting of his body in order to re-enter the feminine, the transpersonal, the nature realms. Same with Attis. She was dismemberment, disremembering, disembodiment, and her own or their own splitting, being forced to enter this patriarchal male world and in a feminine but mother way, in a different mother way. So this duality of splitting. And so both Cybele and Attis are so representative of this original trauma. And Glendining with this concept talks about it so much in terms of domestication. She spends quite a bit talking about the process that we saw in agricultural revolution of the castration of animals, and of course the control of animals, the splitting of our gender roles, our agricultural focus, our fixation on growing populations, and of course patriarchy. And the Cybele Attis myth embodies this original trauma, this wild, tame dichotomy. So really making us from our wild selves to this tame self. And there's so much in terms of representation of castration as opposed to being having to become a homogenous gender as opposed to allowed to be ambiguous, allowed to be androgynous, allowed to be multiplicitous. And so really, really tapping into that. One of the scholars, one of the quotes, Attis cut off his testicles in order to break with a baser and material world and gain access to immortal life where there is no longer either male or female. And so this myth is definitely an archetype of transformation. And the transformative key is to remember and the completeness of the undivided self. So in the next slide, let's get back to Jung and redeem and love him again. And this is something that I'll be working with for so long, and there's just so much here, but I just wanted to bring in a few concepts that just so deeply relate to this story, and just like the beauty of not only the story, but the transformative power for the story of today. And the androgyny for Jung was the integration of the opposites, or the state of individuation of the autonomous individual. So the power of being an androgynous being, it doesn't mean you have to dress a certain way or look a certain way, but really with our psyches and our souls and our sensory awareness and our transpersonal capacities. And Mircea Eliade and Carl Jung both saw the androgynous being as this projection of the longing for return to the primordial unity, escaping from the unbearable tension of opposites for a mode of humanity no longer divided into halves. And that's by a scholar, that quote by Roscoe, not a direct quote, but this idea. And I love the quote, I believe it's in an article by Jones that says, quoting the Gospel of Thomas, which is just so, when you make the male and the female into a single one, so that the male shall not be male and the female shall not be female, then you shall enter the kingdom. So, we need to bring this into Sunday church. And then there's, of course, the concept of the, I think I always pronounce it, but the Syzygy, and where we constantly see these icons of the male and female together, whether it's deities, also usually a male and female deity together. And so this motif is, just saying the masculine and the feminine always are together, that nothing exists without these opposites. And then when we pull it really together, no soul is one gender or another, that we have all of this contained. And that brings up so many transpersonal notions of just like descent into this earthly plane, and like how we manifest into different material bodies to represent our journeys here. But like, this kind of feels interesting. And then, of course, the conjunctio, which in short is the being beyond gender differences, and how mystics of both Eastern and Western traditions describe the bliss of abiding love, that it's a marrying of opposites, an alchemical process. And then, of course, almost the same, the hieros gamos, where we have a joining of the opposites or union, and frequently imagined as gamos, a holy marriage, the fruit of which is called the philosopher's stone. And so many presentations have talked about the transcendent function, and really this archetype of this myth of Cybele and Attis really represents this in terms of images of wholeness, when we're faced with an insolvable conflict. It's like, okay, this story is so bizarre and complex, and there's so many ways to spin it. It puts us in perpetual cognitive dissonance. And then just a couple ending things. Jung wasn't really talking, the title starts with atonement to the Earth Mother, Cybele. And I love that atonement, like we need to apologize to the Great Mother. But then, of course, it also says at-one-ment, bringing all of these multiple scattered parts together, recollecting them. And then there's just so much. We could have a whole nother presentation on the anima as related to this, but I just love this final quote from Jung, that behind all her cruel sporting with human fate, there lies something like a hidden purpose which seems to reflect a superior knowledge of life's laws. And the more the meaning is recognized, the more the anima loses her impetuous and compulsive character. So let's go to the next slide. As a good academic, I have to provide some references. Yeah, so here's some of my favorite references for this one. And then in the next slide. Oh yeah, take a picture.
I can't read it all that quickly.
Right, yeah, you can't read that one. But yeah, some fascinating sources. When this summer, I was like, do I have enough content to do and then I opened up the file that I've been working on, and I had like 40 pages of just notes from books and articles. And I said, oh, I think I could put something together. And then in the final slide, we've got the Magnum Mother, and I just want to really express my gratitude again to everyone for being present with kind of a bizarre story, and of course to CIIS and the East-West Psychology Program and CG Jung Institute, and of course to Cybele and Attis and Agdistis.
Open it up for questions. We only have about 5 minutes now because we don't want to cut it too tight, but you can come up to the front and ask a question.
Thinking of Dionysius and those rites where everybody goes crazy and tears everybody apart and stuff, and the bigender role of Dionysius. So I was just wondering, how have you put those together?
That's an excellent question. There was so much more material for all of this, and I did get a little bit into like the Eleusinian rites and all of these Dionysies and so many of the goddesses associated and of these like multiple nights or week rituals where a lot of people said psychedelics are involved and all these definitely archetypes of transformation. And I think this was a way when they were bringing this Phrygian Anatolia goddess into Greek at a time where so many of the Phrygian and Anatolian people were coming into what is now Greek civilization as a way to include their culture into this. So they kind of Eleusinianed it up into this pot, such as like I know I was born Catholic, yet I have such different roots, but and we know like Christianity incorporated all of these kind of more pagan and earth-based traditions. So people will be like, oh, this can be workable. So yeah, and there's so much there. One of the sources I used really talked about all of these various priests and traditions that related to that. So yeah, there's such a connection. Oh yeah, maybe one more question.
Thank you. Loved it. My question's about the galley. I was so interested. I'd never heard about that before. And you mentioned that I was curious about whether they were self-castrated or castrated by, because I think that has psychological implications. Right. And the other aspect of that is, do you see Cybele's story as a dynamic, a continuum, a narrative, or she developed, or she incarnated, she constellated, we would use that word in the Jungian world, she constellated in the negative mother form, so she was more the whole positive mother and she became more the negative, or is it more that these are just different aspects we know about? Thanks.
Excellent question, and the answer is yes to all of that. And yeah, I think Cybele basically got put into this role that was not hers, because she was all about her origins as this wild, and then she became civilized and contained and representing something else. But I feel like it's an archetype of transformation for now, especially as like suddenly the whole world, and the Gallian particularly, like in the US, suddenly we're like inundated with all these drag motifs and memes, and drag culture isn't the same as like spiritual third gender culture, and there's so many different things, but it also, drag culture is like an archetype of like, cognitive dissonance for folks, and also empowerment and reclamation. And so it's almost like the collective unconscious has been holding all of this stuff that's like, well, the feminine's gonna get in no matter what. So we're breaking through, and these are all the forms that's coming in. So, buckle up. We're here. So I think it's just like such a powerful thing. So yeah. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.